This video is the first in a series on the ethical theory of St. Thomas Aquinas. We'll be reading from Aquinas' magnum opus, the Summa Theologiae, arguably the greatest work of theology in the Western tradition. The method he uses in this work may take a bit of getting used to for the unfamiliar. Aquinas follows the medieval method of disputation, which has the following structure. First, some question is framed, some question of philosophical or theological interest about which there might be different contending opinions. Several objections to the anticipated answer are proposed. And then an authority, usually, is cited who supports the anticipated answer. The answer is given, and then responses to each of the objections are given. And this format may take some getting used to, but once you get used to it, I think you will find it to be a very clear, precise, rigorous, and economical way to present philosophy. The appeal to authority is characteristically medieval. We see in this text the reverence for Scripture, but also for the Church Fathers, and even for classical pagan literature. However, Aquinas is a true philosopher. He uses authority in the way Aristotle uses common beliefs or the appearances, the phenomenon, as starting points, as signposts that point to the truth, not as conversation stoppers or substitutes for argument. Now, Thomas Aquinas is an Aristotelian. Aristotle, aka the philosopher, was recently rediscovered in the Christian West in Aquinas' time. Aquinas' achievement is traditionally portrayed as accomplishing a synthesis between Christian theology and Christian religion more broadly and Aristotelian philosophy. Consequently, we should expect to see in his ethical theory a number of Aristotelian motifs. At the same time, we should expect a distinctive Thomistic inflection of these motifs. And we certainly see this in our first topic, the topic of this video, Aquinas on the ends of man. So we begin with the first questions of the first part of the second part of the Summa Theologiae. With question 1, the question of man's last end. And looking through the 8 articles of this, we see that it begins with the question of whether it belongs to man to act for an end. A basic question and one with a distinctively Aristotelian flavor. Aquinas argues that it belongs to the nature of man to act for an end on the basis that human actions are only properly human when the person is the master of the action. Human actions are only properly human when the person is the master of the action. So, under what conditions can one be master of one's actions? Well, Aquinas concludes that they have to proceed from a deliberate rational will. A deliberate rational will. And we see here again the influence of Aristotle on this view. However, the will, by its nature, aims at an end and the good. That is to say, Aquinas regards it as a structural feature of the will that it, as you might say, tracks the good. The will is essentially a good detecting and good seeking faculty. So, insofar as the good is an end, again, another Aristotelian presupposition, the will is going to be oriented towards an end, and therefore human actions, qua human, are going to necessarily act for an end. Article 2 asks whether it is proper for the rational nature to act for an end. Aquinas argues that it does not belong to rational nature alone to act for an end, but for all natural things. So this article turns out to be a statement of a general commitment to teleology. All things have an end. All things in nature have a final cause. And for the grounds of this and some argumentation leading to this idea, I would refer you to my playlists on Aristotle's metaphysics, and especially on scholastic metaphysics, where I go through Edward Feser's excellent book on scholastic metaphysics, which incidentally provides a lot of useful background to this discussion of Aquinas, although I'll try to fill in the gaps here, at least minimally, in a sketchy way as necessary. But if you want a fuller account of the kind of metaphysics that this ethical theory is presupposing, I would encourage you to take a look at that playlist, Edward Feser's Scholastic Metaphysics. What's distinctive of man is not that man has an end, but that man knows the end for which he acts and directs himself toward the end. Not just to act for an end per se. Everything has an end for which it acts. All the non-human animals have ends for which they act. But man has an end that is a rational end that he knows he's acting for. And that's what's distinctively human. So that's the point he's making in Article 2. Article 3 concerns whether human acts are specified by their end. What he has in mind here is to say, how do we identify an act? How do we identify what you did? You did something. You performed an action. Which action did you perform? And Aquinas argues, in a way, again, I think that's consistent with Aristotle, that acts receive their species from their end. That is, an act is identified as the specific act it is in reference to its end. And here, it's more natural maybe for us to use the term the intention. We might gloss the point that he's making here by saying that it's the motive that determines which act you performed. And here we might think about some of the examples of the case, I believe, of generosity in one of my earlier videos on Aristotle, on the virtue of generosity, and talking about the virtue, the structure of virtues in general. A virtue is going to be identified as an act of a virtuous act is going to be identified as a particular type of virtuous act in virtue of the motive of the person who was doing it. So two people might both give money to a charity. The outward physical action is exactly the same, but only in one case was this an act of generosity, and that depended upon the motive for which the person was doing the act. Were they doing it just to acquire a good reputation and accolades from people who would say, oh, look how charitable Joe is? Or were they doing it just for its own sake? And it's only in the latter case that they were actually performing a generous action. So just as in Aristotle, once again, the human acts for Aquinas are specified by their end. In Article 4, we get to the question of whether there is one last end of human life. This is a question, again, that Aristotle raised in various contexts. But here I think we get a much clearer and more decisive answer in Aquinas than we did in Aristotle. Is there one last end? He uses this term, last end. We might use alternatives, the last end. We could talk about the ultimate end. I think maybe might capture the idea better for us, or the final end. But this translation uses the last end for this idea. It's sort of the ultimate goal. That's the idea that we're talking about here. For Aquinas, it's part of the structure of human action itself that it aims at an end. However, all that follows from this is that every individual human action aims at an end. It would not follow directly that all of the actions of a human being collectively have a single end. However, this is Aquinas' position, where he says in the answer, absolutely speaking, it is not possible to proceed indefinitely in the matter of ends from any point of view. For in whatsoever things there is an essential order of one to another. If the first be removed, those that are ordained first must of necessity, those who are ordained to the first must of necessity be removed also. Wherefore the philosopher proves that we cannot proceed to infinitude in causes of movement, because then there would be no first mover, without which neither can the others move, since they move only through being moved by the first mover. Now there is to be observed a twofold order in ends, the order of intention and the order of execution. And in either of these orders there must be something first. For that which is first in the order of intention is the principle, as it were, moving the appetite. Consequently, if you remove this principle, there will be nothing to remove the appetite. On the other hand, the principle in execution is that where an operation has its beginning. And if this principle is taken away, no one will begin to work. Now, the principle in intention is the last end, while the principle in execution is the first of the things which are ordained to the end. Consequently, on neither side is it possible to go to infinity, since if there were no last end, nothing would be desired, nor would any action have its term, nor would the intention of the agent be at rest. Well, if there's no first thing among those ordained to the end, none would begin to work at anything, and counsel would have no term, but would continue indefinitely. And then he makes a qualification here, which we don't necessarily need to get into. So what's Aquinas doing here? He's comparing the actions of a human being to a causal chain in nature, to what he refers to as an essential causal series, like a hand using a stick to move a leaf. So you have this portrait where you have, say, there's a hand holding a stick, and the stick is moving a leaf. The person's, let's say, leaning over, and there's a pond there. Now you see why I don't have any animation skills. And they're using a stick to move a leaf, and the leaf is moving, so we'll use some motion lines there. Cartoony motion lines, right? It's moving, but it's moving only because the hand is moving. So if the hand were to stop moving, the stick would stop moving and the leaf would stop moving. That's describes an essential causal series. It's essential to the leaf's motion that the hand is moving. And what Aquinas is doing is drawing a kind of analogy here. So whenever we have an action, we're acting for the sake of some end, but that end itself has to be something that is sufficient to move us to action in itself. And if it's not, if it's something that's only instrumentally good, then there has to be something that is going to be determining us to select that end, some higher level intention. So, you know, you're waiting at the bus stop. That's an action you're performing. Why are you standing there waiting at the bus stop? Well, it's to go to the oral surgeon. Why are you going to the oral surgeon? Well, it's in order to get a root canal. Well, why are you getting a root canal? Well, that's because you want to have, good dental health. Why do you want to have good dental health? Well, you want to have good overall health. Why do you want to have good overall health? Well, then you get into the realm of whatever this overarching thing is. And in this part of the argument, Aquinas doesn't yet say that there needs to be one such thing that all of your actions are aiming at, but it's pretty clear that the relationship of the various intentions to one another are going to ultimately culminate only in something that has a very general overarching character, and that serves as the last end. That's the stopping point in the chain of intentions that gets your action going in the first place. If there wasn't something that finally stopped this chain of questioning, you wouldn't get started going in the first place. And he wants to say, well, you can't have an infinite deferral of this intention, of this reason or motive for acting, because if you did, as it were, the leaf would never start moving. Like we can't keep going on here and saying, well, what's making this man move? Maybe there's someone behind him shaking him or something, right? But there's got to be, something that is shaking him too. And eventually you've got to arrive at something which basically occupies the place in the normal commonsensical way of interpreting the situation that the man has, right? So the man is the thing that's sort of the ultimate cause in this context, not the stick. And if you didn't have a man here moving the stick, you would have no leaf motion either. And so that's the analogy that Aristotle is thinking of here. Similarly, if you didn't have some kind of last end that got your action going, your action would never get going. There needs to be something that serves like this ideal of health or happiness or whatever it might be. So Article 5 asks whether one man can have several last ends. Although it is established in Article 4 that every single action must be linked in a chain of desires to an ultimate or last end, this doesn't say whether there's one or many such ends. As the objections in Article 5 note, so I advise you to read those. I won't go over them here, but I advise you to look at those carefully. It is possible that there could, or even that there should, be many such ends, because there are diverse things that people seem to pursue as last ends. So, for example, maybe health, in my example is from before, is one last end, but maybe there are other things that are last ends. If health would count as one. Arguably, it wouldn't count as one. One could say that, well, you want to be healthy only so that you're able to do other things that are the true last end. So health itself isn't a last end, but it's only a kind of immediate end. And there are other things that would count as the last end. But what are those things? Of course, we're very familiar in Aristotle with options here. And so why couldn't there be a diversity of different things that are last ends? However, Aquinas produces 3 reasons why, quote, it is impossible for one man's will to be directed at the same time to diverse things as last ends. So the 3 reasons he gives are as follows. First, the last end must be complete. It must be complete. It must so fulfill the appetite that there's nothing left to desire. So if I'm healthy, just stick with this example. If I'm healthy, that's great. I'm close to being inclined to say that's something that's almost like a last end in itself. But I'm not completely satisfied. I'm not completely satisfied in my life just by being healthy. I mean, for example, I could be in perfect health, but bored to death, right? So the idea is that the last end, the ultimate end, must be complete. It must fill up your appetite so that there's nothing left to desire. So that's the first point. The second is that he observes that the will is part of nature. And it has a principle like everything in nature. But every natural thing has one principle only. And in the case of the will, this must be the natural good. So if we think about, just the lifespan of a flower or whatever, it has as its natural end to bloom. And that's its natural principle that is within it. When it does that, it's fulfilled its natural end. It's fulfilled its natural good. But what about the will? What is our will naturally, as it were, designed for? That's what he's asking. There must be some one thing that the will is for. It might be complex. I mean, a flower blooming is complex. And whatever satisfies our will could be many times more complex than that. But nonetheless, the point is that there should be one thing if the will is actually a natural thing. And third, voluntary actions get their species from their end. So they must also get their genus from their end. That is, remember, the idea is that a particular action gets the identity it does by virtue of what its end is, as in the example of the generous action I gave earlier. So he says, well, if voluntary actions get their species from their end, then it must also be the case that they get their genus from their end. That is, there must be some, if we take the genus voluntary action, right, and then we have very specific types of voluntary actions. There's brave actions, generous actions, cowardly actions, etc. But what about the genus voluntary action? What is that going to be oriented towards? There has to be some one thing in common to all voluntary actions that make them so, that make them voluntary actions. And since what makes an action specific, the specific action it is its end, it must follow that what makes an action as such is the end of action as such, the last end. So this idea is that the last end will be whatever action as such is oriented toward. That's what the last end will be. And that's got to be one thing, because there's there's a genus here of action, voluntary action as such, and it's unified by the one end that all voluntary action aims at. Article 6 asks whether man will all whatsoever he wills for the last end. And Aquinas holds that yes, man wills whatever he wills for the last end. And he offers two arguments for this. The first is that whatever man desires, he desires under the aspect of the good. Whatever man desires, he desires under the aspect of the good. And this is another good Aristotelian doctrine that we saw. If something is desired as good, it must be desired as tending toward the perfect good. He says, for the beginning of everything is always ordained to its completion. Completion, however, is only achieved through the last end. So there's a sense in which whatever you desire it because you think of it as the good. But if the thing is only complete, of course, if it's not good at all, the action is just a complete misfire. But if it's good but only partially good, then in aiming at the good, you're not really completely satisfying your will because you're aiming at the good. You know, it's good to have a glass of water when you feel your throat getting dry. But that's not the complete good. That was just a partial good. And my will is, as it were, always oriented towards aiming at the complete good. And that's only achieved through the last end. So that's the first line of thinking. And the second is that the last end stands in relation to the appetite as the first mover does in relation to other movements. Thus, the secondary causes of the appetite do not move the appetite, except insofar as they're related to the primary cause, which is the last end. So that's this picture once again. There's got to be some last end, or otherwise there's not going to be movement down at this lower level. Article 7 asks whether all men have the same last end. Do all persons desire the same last end? Well, for Aquinas, the answer is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that all human beings desire the fulfillment of their perfection. Again, go back to the blooming rose. We are like a blooming rose. The blooming rose, as it were, desires. It doesn't consciously desire, but it has as its end blooming. It's part of its natural principle, whatever the mechanism is that enables that to happen. This is part of the natural principle of the rose. It's part of its programming, to use the modern anachronistic way of thinking about everything. It's programmed to do that, right? Well, all human beings also are programmed for something. We might not know what it is, but we're programmed for something, and we desire the fulfillment of our perfection. So in that sense, yes, all men have the same last end. But, of course, also no, they don't have the same last end in the sense that people have different ideas of the thing. So they have different conceptions. So they all have the same. This is the concept-conception distinction, again, that we talked about in relation to eudaimonia in Aristotle. People have different concepts of different conceptions, rather, of the concept of what their perfection would be, what their fulfillment would be. For Aquinas, as a Christian, of course, it must be possible for people to turn away from their perfection, their actual perfection, when they sin. And then finally, for the first question, Article 8, whether other creatures concur in the last end. Is the human last end the same as the last end of other creatures? As, say, someone like Friedrich Nietzsche might say when he says, all life is will to power. The only difference between a rock boulder rolling down a mountain, a lion killing an antelope, and a human being, trying to start up an internet company, is the complexity of what they're doing. All things have the same end for someone like Friedrich Nietzsche, who says all life is will to power. But for Aquinas, the answer is a clear no. The last end for human beings isn't the same as the last end of other creatures. And here Aquinas appeals to his theory of human action. Human action is voluntary. Its voluntariness consists in its knowing the end and choosing the end. And non-rational creatures are unable to know or choose in this way. although they do have, in a sense, the same end God, they have it in a way that doesn't concur with the way the human being has it, because of the human being's ability to self-consciously will that end. Okay, second question. Things in which man's happiness consists. So here we go through the litany of the different conceptions of happiness, and we see, of course, here a direct parallel with Aristotle, although Aquinas is going to have different arguments for the things that he thinks are failures as types of happiness, and why they're the consequences of their, why they are failures, the reasoning behind his conclusion that they are failures. So first, whether man's happiness consists in wealth. Aquinas argues it's impossible for man's happiness to consist in wealth. And he notes here wealth is of two kinds. There's natural wealth, food, clothing, shelter, etc., and artificial wealth, money, currency. The former, natural wealth, is only for the sake of something else. It's a support of human nature. And the latter is only for the sake of natural wealth. So he's not going to deny that some degree of natural wealth is a good thing, but your happiness doesn't consist in natural wealth. In fact, as we'll see later on, it's really neither necessary nor sufficient for happiness to have wealth. Article 2, whether man's happiness consists in honors. So a person is honored for Aquinas because of some excellence in him. A person's excellence is in proportion to his happiness and the parts of happiness. Hence, a person is honored because of his happiness or some part thereof. Hence, his happiness cannot consist in his being honored. The account would be circular. It's like being famous for being famous. Or it's like if you came up to a person and said, "Hey, congratulations." The person looked at you and said, "For what?" And they said, "Well, I'm saying congratulations to you just because I want you to be happy. So I'm going to give you some honor." that would make no sense. And that's basically Aquinas' point. The person is honored because you can honor them and say congratulations, but there's got to be something you're congratulating them for. Otherwise, you're putting the cart before the horse. Article 3, whether man's happiness consists in fame or glory. Here's the distinction that's less clear in Aristotle. Fame or glory consists in human knowledge of another person. Why are the Kardashians famous? Because everyone knows who they are. So it consists in knowledge of another person. But human knowledge, unlike God's knowledge, is insufficient to cause happiness for Aquinas. In fact, typically the causal influence runs in the opposite direction. The happiness of a person, or apparent happiness, is what, when it becomes widely known, makes them famous and causes people to glorify them. So once again, the causal connection is inverted if one thinks that fame can make you happy. Because fame comes from people's consciousness of your happiness, not the other way around. Further, Aquinas adds, fame and glory are often deceptive, for they can be based on false impressions, and thus they are too unstable to constitute happiness. Article 4, whether man's happiness consists in power. Here Aquinas gives two reasons why happiness cannot consist in power. First, power has the nature of a principle, whereas happiness has the nature of a last end. So power is, you think of it in terms of efficient causality, the power to push something, to force something. That's power. That's the nature of a power, to initiate a series of actions by being a kind of spark plug for them, so to speak. That's the character of power. But what for? Power sort of, it's like fuel, right? You might have a lot of fuel, but if you don't have any use for that fuel, it doesn't do anything for you. And power is kind of like that. In other words, it's got the nature of something that can execute, have this executive force, but you need to have some aim or end that you're trying to execute. Otherwise, it's useless. And so happiness has the character of being that end. Of course, here, again, we could bring up Friedrich Nietzsche and the idea of power as being the ultimate principle. This is why in Nietzsche, there's this problem of nihilism that arises from his metaphysical outlook. Because if all there is power, and there is no end that this power is attempting to execute, it seems like everything just becomes pointless and meaningless. It's just power for the sake of power. In fact, there's a deep question as to whether this notion is even intelligible, ultimately, if you view it as just raw power just exercising itself for no end. Also related to this, and another good point that Nietzsche would appreciate, is that power can be used for either good or evil. Power is beyond good and evil, to use a title from one of Nietzsche's works. But happiness for Aquinas is not beyond good and evil. Happiness concerns the attainment of the good and the avoidance, in fact, the absolute avoidance and exclusion of evil. And so that's another reason to think power can't be happiness. Now, at this point, Aquinas makes some general comments about all of the four preceding goods, which he correctly identifies in good Aristotelian fashion as external goods. And so, in general, about wealth, honor, fame, and power, he says, about all these things, they can all be found in both good and evil people. But happiness is only the possession of the good. It's man's supreme good, and so it's only attained by the good man. It's the attainment of the perfection of man, and so it's only obtained by the good or perfect man. In the same way that the bloom of a flower is not going to be obtained by an imperfect, a diseased flower or something. It's not going to ever open. It's not going to ever bloom. So these external goods can be found in both good and evil people, but happiness only belongs to the good man, because happiness is the supreme good of mankind. Second, none of these external goods are completely satisfying in themselves, but happiness by nature must be satisfying in itself. Third, wealth, honor, fame, and power can all bring harm to a person, but happiness cannot bring harm to a person. And fourth, happiness is something that human beings are naturally ordained to, as he puts it. The word ordained, maybe we think of the ordination of a priest or a minister, and that gives you the sense of what this means. Basically, it's like you're given this particular mission, this particular assignment, right? It's what you're, as it were, pushed and set on your way to go do. And that's what he's saying, human beings are naturally ordained to happiness. Rather optimistic perspective, of course, that would be denied by some people like Schopenhauer, for example, or Nietzsche. But again, that's his view. Happiness is something that human beings are naturally ordained to, but external goods are not natural, but the result of good fortune. So they can't be happiness. Article 5, whether man's happiness consists in any bodily good. Well, Aquinas argues that the preservation of the body cannot be man's happiness, since his will and his reason are ordained to something higher than man himself. Here he relies on his philosophical anthropology, which divides the human being into a form and a matter, a soul and a body. So the being of the body depends upon the soul, but the being of the soul does not depend upon the body. Now, this idea that you have the human being, and it's a kind of hylomorphic unity. That is to say, a unity of a form, which is the soul. Oh, running out of ink here. Plus the matter, which is the body. Hopefully you can read this. Can you read that there? We got the reflection going on, all kinds of technical difficulties. Human being is a hylomorphic unity of form and matter, where the form is the soul, the matter is the body. So, and this is basically an Aristotelian notion as well. The being of the body depends upon the soul. The soul is something like, as with the classical Greek tradition, something like the unifying life principle of the body, the thing that holds the physical matter together and makes, a large composite of various cuts of meat into an organism that actually functions and is animated and is able to have locomotion and to reproduce and to think and higher animals and so forth. So that's what the soul is. And so the body depends upon the soul in that sense. But the being of the soul does not depend upon the body, since the soul has this higher existence of being the form. Body is for the soul as matter is for the form. So all the goods of the body are for the sake of the good of the soul as well. The body exists for the sake of the soul, not the soul for the body. Article 6, whether man's happiness consists in pleasure. And so Aquinas' theory of pleasure is that every delight is a proper accident resulting from happiness or from some part of happiness. Pleasure and delight are used interchangeably here. So every delight is a proper accident resulting from happiness or some part of happiness. Accident, the term accident means something that is a real property of the thing, but it's not an essential property. So an accident is a property of a substance that it could lose and still remain that substance. So you can lose your hair and still be a human being. That your hair is an accidental property. It's not an essential property in that sense. Every delight is a proper accident that results from happiness or from some part of happiness. So, and he's saying that it's a proper accident, saying that it's proper to happiness to have it attended by delight, having it attended by pleasure. Pleasure is the result of some person possessing some fitting good. And if this fitting good, fitting is in the sense of that's appropriate, fitting, if this fitting good is perfect, then it's happiness itself. If it's imperfect, it's a part of happiness. Bodily pleasures are the result of a good apprehended by sense. But such a good cannot be man's perfect good for the simple reason that the body is limited to the finite and the particular. Whereas the soul, our intellect, tells us that there's something infinite that's beyond the finite and the particular. Our will desires a complete, infinite good, not just some particular good. And so all bodily goods are going to be just particular goods in that sense. They're not going to satisfy the will of an intellect that has this ability to touch the infinite. Article 7, whether some good of soul constitutes man's happiness. So if bodily goods aren't constitutive of happiness, maybe some good of the soul is. And here he says, well, the soul itself is not man's last end, since it's nothing natural in itself. Sorry, nothing natural, nothing actual in itself. It exists only as a potentiality, not as an actuality. It's a potentiality for knowing, sensing, etc. But the last end has to be something actual. It can't be merely potential. So the soul is like this. It exists as a kind of potentiality or power in the body. And it's able to manifest itself in various actual ways, various acts in which it exists. But in itself, it's not something that could be an end. Likewise, neither can the goods of the soul, its power, its habits, its acts, be man's last end. Again, because of the point that these are only particular goods, not the universal good. So, evidently here, just virtue, just like possessing a virtue at a natural level, isn't for Aquinas suitable to be man's last end, because that would just be a particular good. It would just be a finite, limited good. It wouldn't be infinite. It wouldn't be universal. happiness may belong to the soul, but that which constitutes happiness must be something outside of the soul, which the soul participates in. So happiness is a kind of relation that the soul has to other things. It's not something that ever is just self-sufficiently contained within the soul. And then finally, for question 2, Article 8, whether any created good constitutes man's happiness. For similar reasons as why the soul can't be the last end, no created good can be constitutive of happiness. This is because happiness is the perfect good that completely satisfies the appetite. But no particular good could ever achieve that. Only the universal good could achieve that. The will is hardwired, again, we might say, or programmed in such a way that it can never be satisfied by any particular good. Okay. Question 3, what is happiness? Is happiness something uncreated? In one sense, our ultimate end is nothing other than God himself, who obviously is something uncreated. So that's the first point Aquinas makes. Our ultimate end is nothing other than God himself, who is obviously something uncreated. However, speaking in another sense, our happiness consists not in God, but in the attainment or enjoyment of God. And this is something that is created by God in us. So that's Aquinas' view of happiness. Happiness is the attainment or enjoyment of God. And here, obviously, we don't run into that problem of the mere finitude or particularity of the object. God as an infinite and absolutely universal object in scare quotes, has the ability to completely fill up the will and to completely satisfy it. But happiness, strictly speaking, isn't God, but rather the attainment or enjoyment of God. And that is a created thing. That is something that God creates in us, according to Aquinas. In Article 2, Aquinas describes happiness as an operation. So this is an operation. In other words, a kind of continuous activity. And we know he intends to mean by this the same thing that Aristotle means when he describes happiness as an activity, because he cites Aristotle in support of this, as an authority in support of this idea. So this happiness, this attainment or enjoyment of God is an activity, an operation, a kind of continuous activity or condition, an active condition, we might say. So whereas Aristotle would have said that happiness is an activity rather than a state, Aquinas would say it's an operation, the condition of being active or some kind of a continuous activity. In answering this question of whether happiness is an operation, he relies upon the scholastic metaphysics of potentiality and actuality. And again, I refer you to the playlist on scholastic metaphysics for the appropriate videos where you can get more detail on this if you're interested. But just very quickly, the actual is what acts, what is active. Each thing is perfect insofar as it is actual. To exist in scholastic terminology is to be in act. That's what they mean by in act. It exists. And the ultimate or last act of the human being is its last act. Sounds like the last part of a play or something like that. But the last act, the ultimate act, it's sort of the culmination of your existence, which doesn't mean that the existence ends, but it means that when your existence reaches its perfection, that's happiness. That's the operation of happiness. That's, in that sense, the last act. You're in act in the sense of being in the act of being perfect. You're caught in the act, so to speak, of being perfect. That's the actuality that's being spoken of here. So man's happiness must consist of an operation, the condition of being active. And this condition, when it's perfected, is the last act, which is the greatest perfection that the will and the human being can attain, and that's going to be the condition of happiness, which occurs through the attainment and enjoyment of God. Article 3, whether happiness is an operation of the sensitive part or the intellective part only. So man's ultimate or perfect happiness consists of being united to God, and no operation of the senses can do this. So this is not, the enjoyment of God isn't, seeing God with your eyes. It's not, in that sense, a physical operation of the senses. Although he says the operation of the senses can belong to happiness antecedently and consequently, in the sense that the operation of the senses is involved in the imperfect happiness which can be had in this life. So this happiness then is the standard of perfection. But there's going to be an approach to this that Aquinas is going to continue to fill in details about in the upcoming exposition that constitutes a kind of imperfect happiness. So you get this division in Aquinas between the happiness of this life and the happiness of the next life. In this life, happiness is imperfect, but in the next life, it will be perfect. And this imperfect happiness, as we'll see, is essentially the acquiring of virtue, the righteousness of the will that will enable one to attain and enjoy God. But that's only ever imperfectly achieved in this life. And then in the next life, in the afterlife, one can hope to achieve the perfect attainment and enjoyment of God. So there's this imperfect, partial, incomplete happiness that can be attained in this life, but it's not true happiness. It's not the real deal. And in this life, then, there's an operation of the senses that can prepare the intellect for seeing God. In fact, the intellect, on an Aristotelian theory of perception, the intellect requires some previous operation of sense. I won't get into the details of that. But for Aquinas, the point is that in heaven, our intellect will overflow the operation of the senses, not discard it altogether. And this is crucial. The idea isn't just that heaven is a place where, like The Good Place on NBC or whatever, which I haven't seen except in clips, but it's not a place that's just like our world, except it's, without trash in the gutters or whatever, that kind of thing. No one gets sick or whatever. Otherwise, it's just like our world. Rather, heaven is something that can't really be imagined because our imagination relies on the senses, and heaven is going to involve the intellect overflowing the operation of the senses in a way that it never really does, or only partially does, in this world. Okay. Article 4. If happiness is in the intellective part, is it an operation of the intellect or the will? Here, what he's dealing with is the kind of trickiness within a Christian context where love is traditionally understood to be an act of the will and also understood to be the greatest act that one can perform, of reconciling that with the idea of the attainment and enjoyment of God as a matter of the intellect knowing God. So, in response, Aquinas distinguishes between the essence of happiness and the proper accident of happiness that I referred to earlier. The essence is the attainment of the last end itself. He explains that this attainment cannot be an operation of the will because the operation of the will is a desire, and desire is for what is absent. Happiness, as an attainment, consists of the presence of what is willed or desired. And this presence pertains to the intellect. Once this attainment is present, willing is no longer operating as desiring. On the other hand, Aquinas allows that the proper accident of this attainment, namely the delight that accompanies it, does indeed pertain to the will. So he explains this by an analogy with a covetous person's willing to attain money. So he desires money, And then once he attains the money, he doesn't desire it anymore, but he just delights in it. But that delight pertains to the will. So it is the proper accident of happiness that the will experience the delight, but the will won't be operating anymore as will, as desiring. So strictly speaking, happiness is in the intellective part. It's not in an operation of the it's in the operation of the intellect, rather, not in the operation of the will. But the will as delight does constitute a proper accident of happiness. And all that is just a way of saying, we can actually align these in this way, that the attainment, it pertains to the intellect, which attains to the vision of God. And the enjoyment, if we construe that as involving the delight, that involves the will's resting in God. Once it's finally achieved what it's been chasing after its entire life and desiring. It no longer desires, now it enjoys. Article 5, whether happiness is an operation of the speculative or of the practical intellect. And Aquinas holds that it's an operation of the speculative intellect rather than the practical. Man's highest good must be an operation of his highest power in respect of its highest object, and the speculative intellect is man's highest power. Contemplation is sought for its own sake, but the practical intellect aims not at its own operations, but at something outside them, namely action. And in the contemplative life, man has something in common with God and the angels. So we see here, in aligning happiness with the satisfaction of the speculative intellect or contemplation of the vision of God, rather than the satisfaction of the practical intellect, which leads to action. Aquinas is aligning himself pretty clearly here with what Aristotle said as well. But immediately in Article 6, he differentiates himself from Aristotle, because Aristotle thought that the contemplative life is the life of study in the speculative sciences, in physics and metaphysics. Thomas, however, disagrees with Aristotle, insofar as he had insisted on tethering the speculative sciences to what can be received through the senses. It's the search for the first causes of what's given to the senses for Aristotle. So even metaphysics is tied to the senses. But Thomas had already established that man's final perfection must be something above the human intellect, completely beyond the senses. So he doesn't think of it in the same way as Aristotle does, what contemplation consists in. For Aristotle, contemplation consists in engaging in metaphysics, engaging in physics, trying to come up with the ultimate causal explanations of the physical universe. Whereas for Aquinas, it consists in completely going beyond the created universe for him and having a pure vision of God. Does happiness consist in knowledge of the angels as well? This is akin to asking whether happiness involves something like the knowledge of the Platonic forms. And he thinks this can't be the final perfection of the human intellect, because even if there were such things as Platonic forms, they would still be limited and not absolutely infinite. At most, they'd be infinite in their kind, but they wouldn't have the kind of infinity that God has. And so the human will can only find rest, can only find its complete object, its complete good in something that's absolutely infinite like God. Article 8, whether man's happiness consists in the vision of the divine essence. Whether any created good. Oops. Sorry, clicked the wrong link here. So I'm going to read this last one. I answer that final and perfect happiness can consist in nothing else than the vision of the divine essence. To make this clear, 2 points must be observed. First, that man is not perfectly happy so long as something remains for him to desire and seek. Second, that the perfection of any power is determined by the nature of its object. Now the object of the intellect is what a thing is, i.e. the essence of a thing. Wherefore the intellect attains perfection, insofar as it knows the essence of a thing. If, therefore, an intellect knows the essence of some effect, whereby it is not possible to know the essence of a cause, i.e. to know the cause what it is, that intellect cannot be said to reach that cause simply, although it may be able to gather from the effect the knowledge of what that cause is. Consequently, when a man knows an effect, he knows that it has a cause, and knows that it has a cause. There naturally remains in the man the desire to know about that cause, what it is. And this desire is one of wonder and causes inquiry, as stated at the beginning of the Metaphysics. For instance, if a man, knowing the eclipse of the sun, consider that it must be due to some cause, and know not what that cause is, he wonders about it, and from wondering proceeds to inquire. Nor does this inquiry cease until he arrive at a knowledge of the essence of that cause. If, therefore, the human intellect, knowing the essence of some created effect, knows no more of God than that he is, the perfection of that intellect does not yet reach simply the first cause, but there remains in it the natural desire to seek the cause. Wherefore, it is not yet perfectly happy. Consequently, for perfect happiness, the intellect needs to reach the very essence of the first cause, and thus it will have its perfection through union with God, as with that object in which alone man's happiness consists, as stated above. So this, we might think here about the objection that sometimes is raised if you see debates between cosmologists, physicists like Sean Carroll and Christian apologists, and someone like the physical cosmologist will often say that look, you can appeal to God through your cosmological argument, which is, of course, is what Aquinas is describing here, a cosmological argument that says there must be a first cause in order to explain how anything comes to be. But I would say that cause is not well defined. Now, I even would say to you, Christian apologists, speaking now as if I were an atheist physicist debating a Christian apologist, I could even say to you that you don't even know what this thing is, this God that you're talking about as the first cause. And Aquinas is actually siding and agreeing here with the physicist and saying, yes, our intellect isn't satisfied because just through the natural operations of the intellect, it leads us to the belief that there must be some kind of immensely powerful first cause that caused the Big Bang or the fine-tuning of the universe or whatever it might be. Just from that, we don't know the essence of God, but we want to. And that would be our complete happiness, the union with God whereby our intellect would actually understand the essence of God. Can we do it now and in this life? Over here? No, we can't. We can't attain that happiness, but hopefully we could attain it in some future existence. All right, so that leads to the first discussion question. Do you agree with Aquinas that only the intellectual contemplation of the essence of God can give rest and satisfaction to the truth-seeking intellect? Why or why not? Is this an apt, that is, an appropriate or suitable conception of happiness? Why or why not? So, first discussion question, do you agree with Aquinas that only the intellectual contemplation of the essence of God can give rest and satisfaction to the truth-seeking intellect? Why or why not? Is this an apt, that is it an appropriate, a suitable conception of happiness? Why or why not? Okay, question 4. Things that are required for happiness. Is delight required for happiness? Is pleasure required for happiness in that sense, but delight? And he says, well, in a sense, delight is necessary for happiness, not as a preparation for it or to perfect it or help it in some way, but rather delight is necessary for happiness as something attendant on it. He says, as heat is necessary for fire. Delight is caused, on Aquinas' theory, by the appetite being at rest in the good attained. Remember that example of the covetous person who finally gets that money and just, my money, right? Just delighting. Well, when the intellect and the will come to rest in God, there is a kind of delight that attains that. The sight of God is by itself sufficient for happiness. But the very sight of God causes delight. And so delight always necessarily attends happiness. In that sense, it's necessary for happiness. Because it necessarily attends happiness. Because the sight of God is happiness, and the sight of God is just always delightful. So there's always going to be delight. Article 2, whether in happiness vision ranks before delight. Here the idea is, he says that delight consists in a certain repose of the will. Repose of the will. The will finally rests. The restless will that's always desiring finally rests in God, and then that's experienced as delightful, like being able to rest after a long period of working. But the will can find rest in a thing only due to the goodness of the thing in which it reposes. Just like the body can find rest only in a good, suitable place to rest, a comfortable bed, for example. Therefore, if the will reposes in an operation, that can only be due to the goodness of the operation. I'm talking about operation in this sense here. The operation of the intellect that consists in the contemplation of God. So the good, if the will is able to rest in that operation, that must be because of the goodness of that operation. The will doesn't seek the good for the sake of reposing, but rather for the sake of the goodness of what it reposes in. Thus, the goodness of the operation the will reposes in ranks higher than the goodness of the reposing of the will itself. Hence, when the will takes delight in vision, this shows that vision ranks higher than the delight. In Article 3, whether comprehension is necessary for happiness, and here it's rather technical. We don't need to dwell too long on this, but he distinguishes between the vision, the comprehension, and the delight or enjoyment. So the vision is the perfect knowledge of the intelligible, and vision is, as it were, something subjective, being somewhat inappropriate in that use of terminology, but the vision is the perfect knowledge of the intelligible end, but the comprehension implies the presence of the end. Comprehension is really being in the presence of God. And then delight or enjoyment implies, of course, the repose of the lover and the object beloved. So the comprehension represents the end point of the searching for the object of the intellect, when that thing is actually present. And Aquinas suggests here that human beings also have an innate inkling of God that's responsible for the prompting of the will to seek out the adequate or perfect comprehension of what is at first only dimly conceived. And when perfect knowledge of God is attained in vision, then comprehension occurs and we become sort of, as it were, present to God, or God becomes present to us in a way that he isn't otherwise. Article 4, whether rectitude of the will is necessary for happiness. The foregoing discussion naturally raises the question of whether the character of the will, whether it's good or bad, matters for happiness. After all, Aristotle has made happiness sound so far like a very intellectual matter. Just the vision and comprehension of God, it might be delightful, but does the will have to be actually a good will? Well, Aristotle argues that the end of happiness relates to the will like form to matter. He says, just as matter cannot receive a form unless it be duly disposed thereto, so nothing gains an end except to be duly ordained thereto. So nothing can attain happiness without rectitude of the will. Aristotle's notion that only the virtuous man sees the good accurately also plays here. In order to attain to the vision of God, who is perfectly good, one must have a will that loves insubordination to God, that has the right orientation toward what is truly good in one's will. Is the body necessary for man's happiness? Well, here is one of the places where we see a division between perfect and imperfect. He will go on to say that the body is necessary for a kind of imperfect happiness. It's not necessary to perfect happiness. But there's a twist to this here. Now, you will say that actually the perfection of the body can be part of perfect happiness in the next life. And this, it seems, has got to be inspired by the Christian doctrine of the resurrection of the body and the idea that the life to come includes not just a kind of disembodied Platonic or Cartesian soul, but actually includes a new resurrection body. So is the body necessary for man's happiness? Well, in one sense, no, because the intellect can see the vision of God without the body, and so the body is not necessary for happiness in that sense. Because remember, this seeing isn't the seeing of the eyes. It's a kind of intellectual seeing that we can't really comprehend when we're in our natural state. But in Article 6, he'll go on to say that the perfection of the body is necessary for happiness when the body, in other words, is perfected in a way that goes beyond the natural. It's proper to the soul to have a body, and having a body, he says, adds a certain charm and perfection to happiness. But the body needs to be perfected in a way that doesn't prove to be a hindrance to happiness. And our natural bodies are going to be a hindrance to happiness, because when the soul is in our natural bodies, we can't just gaze upon God infinitely. We get tired, we have to sleep, right? All these problems. And so there's got to be a perfected body that goes beyond our natural body. And then that kind of body could be part of perfect happiness. Article 7 considers whether any external goods are necessary for happiness. And he says external goods are necessary for the kind of happiness attainable in this life, again, the imperfect happiness, primarily as the means to the operation of virtue. But external goods are not necessarily at all for perfect happiness, which consists in seeing God. The point is, seeing God is sufficient all by itself for happiness. Maybe virtuous activity in this life, as Aristotle noted, isn't sufficient for happiness. But seeing God in the next life is sufficient for happiness, all by itself. So you don't need any other goods. And finally, in question 4, Article 8, whether the fellowship of the friend is necessary for happiness. And once again, Aquinas allows that friends are necessary for the kind of imperfect happiness that's attainable in this life, but not in the perfected happiness of the next life. Delighting in friends is a joy, but delighting in God far surpasses any delighting in friends. So whatever that delight is of the friend, I mean, you would have infinitely more delight of that kind in the vision of God and in the comprehension of God. Being present to God or having God be present to you would just be like, staring at the sun as opposed to staring at a light bulb when compared to even the best interactions with friends on this in this existence. All right, the final question, question 5, the attainment of happiness. Article 1, whether man can attain happiness. What does he say? I answer that happiness is the attainment of the perfect good. Whoever, therefore, is capable of the perfect good can attain happiness. Now, that man is capable of the perfect good is proved both because his intellect can apprehend the universal and perfect good, and because his will can desire it, and therefore man can attain happiness. This can be proved again from the fact that man is capable of seeing God. And he refers to the first part of the Summa Theologiae, in which vision, as we stated above, man's perfect happiness consists. So man's intellect can apprehend the perfect and universal God, and his will can desire it. Therefore, man can attain happiness. That might seem too quick, but here he's relying on the assumption, or a set of assumptions, I should say, that God is purely actual. God is purely actual, and therefore intrinsically is supremely knowable. Because the perfections could be a second assumption. The perfection of the intellect is to know what's intrinsically knowable. And that's God. And furthermore, the ultimate perfection of the rational creature is to be found in that which is the principle of its being. And God is the principle of its being. So it turns out here actually that part of the broader argument for whether man can attain happiness is, does God exist? And what's God's nature? What's God like? And so the first part of the Summa Theologiae deals famously with these questions. with the arguments for the existence of God and the elaboration of the nature of God and so on. And that is part of Aquinas' ethical theory, because we can't really positively answer the question of whether man can attain happiness until we know what the principle of man is, that is, what the ultimate cause of man is. Does man have a creator or not? And it's essential to Aquinas' positive and optimistic answer to the question that, yes, happiness is attainable, that there is a God, and that God has created us, and there is a certain nature to this God that can assure us that man can attain happiness. So I note that here, but we can't go into all those arguments. That would take us too far afield from ethical theory. But it's important that does lie in the background, and that he does have arguments for that conclusion. The second article asks whether one man can be happier than another. And here he says, well, happiness consists in the enjoyment of God, but some men are better disposed to enjoy him, and therefore those men are happier than others. Article 3, whether one can be happy in this life. Can one be happy in this life? Short answer is no. One can have a certain participation of happiness in this life, but not the real deal, not perfect happiness. It belongs to the idea of happiness that every desire is fulfilled, but this cannot be attained in this life. It also belongs to the state of happiness that all evil is excluded, but this life is inevitably beset by many evils. Further, the goods of this life inevitably pass away. First and foremost, life itself. So no, happiness cannot be attained in this life. At best, there's a kind of partial, imperfect, substitute form of happiness, partial form of happiness. Article 4 asks whether happiness once had can be lost. Can happiness be lost if it's obtained? And again, there's a division here between the imperfect form of happiness in this life, which isn't real happiness at all, and the perfect form of happiness in the next life. In this life, imperfect happiness can be lost, since it's tied to virtue, and one can lose one's virtue by the will's turning away from the true good. And so you can lose happiness, the imperfect form, in this life. However, the perfect happiness that can be attained in the afterlife cannot be lost. Why? Why is that? Well, he says perfect happiness must necessarily set desire perfectly at rest. Perfect happiness sets desire perfectly at rest. But this is impossible unless there's no risk of losing it. So in the afterlife, there must be no risk of losing happiness. And second, it's impossible for anyone, he thinks, on seeing the divine essence to wish not to see it. And so the typical conditions that lead us to lose good things in this life, not being completely satisfied with them, being insecure, etc., these sorts of things are not going to pertain to the divine essence. Imperfect happiness can be attained in this life and acquired by a man's natural powers, but the vision of God surpasses all creatures' natural powers. So his answer to the question of Article 5, whether man can attain happiness by his natural powers, is no. It's only through a gift of God that you're able to attain the vision of God. You don't have the natural power to do this. Article 6, whether man can attain happiness through the actions of some higher creature. Yes, God can accomplish what's naturally impossible. Then Article 7, whether any good works are necessary that man may receive happiness from God. And here Aquinas' answer is the sort of thing that drove Martin Luther to a hatred of Aquinas, most likely, where he basically says that works are necessary in order to receive happiness from God. But I'll pass that without comment because we're running short on time, and I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of internecine disputes within Christian theology between Protestants and Catholics, so we'll just leave that one alone. But this article basically goes together with what he had said earlier about the way in which the will sort of has to be conformed to the goodness of God in order to be able to attain the vision of God. And so if one's will has a conception of the good that's not aligned with the goodness of God, then one won't be able to attain the vision of God. I think that's the essential point that Aquinas is getting at there. And then finally, Article 8, whether every man desires happiness. Does every man desire happiness? This may sound like a silly question. The reason it sounds silly, Aquinas would say, is that it belongs to the essence of the will itself to will the perfect good. This is happiness, the perfect good. Hence, to will happiness is simply to desire that one's will be satisfied. And that's just belongs to the nature of the will itself, that the will wills the perfect good, wills happiness, wills that it be satisfied. And so in that sense, which is a purely formal sense, every man desires happiness. However, that just pertains to the general notion of happiness. Again, to the concept of happiness, not to the specific conception, or as Aquinas says, rather, the specific notion of happiness. So what about the specific notion of happiness that Aquinas has been putting forth here? That happiness is the attainment and enjoyment of God. When it comes to the specific notion of happiness as the attainment and enjoyment of God, not every man desires happiness. Why? Because of ignorance, because they do not know that happiness is only to be found in the enjoyment of God, and so they erroneously seek it elsewhere, in wealth and fame and pleasant enjoyments and money and sex, etc., etc. So in that sense, it's not the case that every man desires God. But in the sense that every man desires the perfect good, they do, but they just don't know sort of what's really good for them. That would be the idea, which of course is a very familiar Christian idea. Okay, so this leads to the second discussion question as a conclusion of this video. Second discussion question. Do you agree with Aquinas' view of the attainability of happiness? Is perfect happiness attainable, but only in the afterlife, not in this life? Why or why not? So, second discussion question. Do you agree with Aquinas' view of the attainability of happiness? Is perfect happiness attainable, but only in the afterlife, not in this life? Why or why not?